just a quick reminder that there is a homework quiz assignment due in this class on Wednesday by 11:59 p.m. So please don't forget that. And of course, you know, we have a test coming up this same time next week in the cardiopulmonary A&P class. So make sure you've been kind of practicing and preparing for that. Chapter 8, believe it or not, is a shorter chapter, but there is content in there that is obviously extremely important that we will be testing on Monday. So please make sure you're studying, please make sure you're reviewing. If you thought today's test was challenging, wait till next week. Just throwing that out there right now, just so make sure you're prepared. All right, so chapter 8 is dealing with oxygen and oxygen transport specifically. So when you think about what's in our blood, plasma, white blood cells and platelets, and the red blood cells, where, at least in that schematic, is oxygen being carried? Is it being carried in the plasma? Is it being carried in the little 1% white blood cells and platelets, or in the red blood cells? Yes, and plasma. It is carried in two separate locations. Dissolved in blood plasma, so when you think about oxygen, some of it is dissolved in the blood plasma, and the rest of it is in the red blood cells, specifically bound to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin inside the erythrocyte, inside the red blood cell. So please make sure you're aware of that. When we look at the breakdown between how much oxygen is in the plasma versus how much oxygen is with the platelets, a very small amount of it gets dissolved in plasma. Only about 2% of the total of all the oxygen you're carrying right now, about 2% of it is dissolved in your blood plasma. Whereas the remaining 98% is bound directly to hemoglobin. And that's important. So most of the oxygen you are carrying in your bloodstream right now is bound to hemoglobin. All right, so let's go over both of those. So some oxygen, again, what percentage is dissolved in blood plasma? Only about 2%, so a small percentage. Only about 2% of the oxygen you're carrying is dissolved in the blood plasma. There is a relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and how much gets dissolved, okay, and that's a linear relationship, meaning you double or triple the partial pressure of oxygen, you will double or triple the amount dissolved in the blood plasma. Now there's a little calculation here we'll get to in just a minute. There's a way to calculate, there's a way to predict how much of that oxygen that's dissolved in plasma is actually there, instead of thinking about it as a percentage, to see how much is truly actually there. And we'll get to that in just a minute. All right, plasma, even though it's only carrying 2% of the total oxygen we're carrying, it's still extremely important in determining how adequate tissue oxygenation is. It does help us helps the body determine the rate of diffusion within and across the lungs, as well as with the tissues. So don't totally discount the oxygen that's dissolved in the bloodstream, in the blood plasma, Don't discount that. It is still extremely important, and it does directly relate to how much of that oxygen will ultimately be bound to hemoglobin, which again we said that's where most of the oxygen in our bodies is currently being carried. Hemoglobin. Again, what percentage? 98% of all the oxygen you're carrying in your bloodstream right now, 98% of it is bound to hemoglobin. Obviously, without hemoglobin, our bodies couldn't transport or carry enough oxygen, and we wouldn't be able to survive without it. So hemoglobin is also extremely important in the capabilities of our body to carry and transport and ultimately deliver oxygen to the tissues. Now we get to some of these numbers. I'm not discounting the number that's on the screen here, but we'll get to it a little further explanation in just a second. All right, so I've been holding back completely defining cardiac output. I know I gave you the definition of what it is, but it keeps popping up throughout this chapter. So just to be clear again, every time your heart beats, it pumps blood out of it. Okay, every time it squeezes. Our heart just squeezed 3 times since I've been talking. That last sentence, it's pumping out a certain amount of blood volume. If we measure that volume and how much was coming out of your heart over a minute's time, that by definition is cardiac output. So, assuming an individual has a normal cardiac output, which give or takes around 5 liters a minute. So assuming the heart is still pumping the way it normally should, just another way to say this. Don't get hung up on the number because there'll be a whole class later we'll talk about what that number means. But assuming your heart is pumping adequately and pumping adequate amounts of blood, and assuming your blood's carrying the proper amount of oxygen, the body will deliver about 100 mLs of oxygen to the tissues each minute. I put that 1,000. Did I say 100? Sorry. It's correct on the screen. Thank you. Do as it says, not as I say. So about 1,000 mLs of oxygen is delivered to the tissues every minute. So when the question on the test says how much oxygen is delivered to the tissues each minute, it's going to be 1,000, not 100. I'll put option A to be 100. It'll be 1,000 mLs. But the body requires about 250 mLs of oxygen. Well, it's a good thing we provide more than, not less than, what the bodies or what the tissue requires. So again, just to put it in perspective, our body delivers 1,000 mLs of oxygen per minute, but the tissues only need about 250 mLs of that oxygen per minute. Now, that being said, that's at rest. Of course, if I'm exerting myself, my body's going to need more, and ultimately my body would deliver more. But we're just saying right now, at rest. So, oxygen delivery to the tissues is normally about 4 times what the tissues actually need. In other words, the tissues consume about 25% of the oxygen delivered to them, to the tissues. Okay. Just do a little ratio, make a little simple math here. Okay, so the body extracts about 25% of the oxygen that is delivered to it. My question to you, then what happens to the other 75%? Or what happens to the other 750? Where does it go? Just
The blood bank?
What's that? Say it.
The blood bank?
Kind of. I like that. No, I like that. It's there. It's still going through the circulation. So 1,000 mLs of oxygen is going through, and the body only takes 250, and so there's 750 left. Where does it go? It continues through until we can reoxygenate the blood back to 1,000 mLs, and it goes back through. So that 750 really is there, and I like the blood bank analogy, believe it or not. It's there as a reserve in case we need it. If it wasn't, and again, at rest, my body needed 250 and that's all I got, and suddenly somebody with bad intentions is coming down the hall chasing me, if I take off running, I'm going to completely collapse because my body is going to demand more oxygen to the tissues. Okay, so that 750 there is as a reserve. Simply put, as a reserve in case there's sudden increased metabolic need for more oxygen. It's there. It's there. All right, so the hemoglobin molecule. Again, we said that oxygen, 98% of the total oxygen we're carrying is going to be bound to hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin molecule, large complex protein molecule that's found in the erythrocyte, fancy way of saying found in the red blood cell. And one hemoglobin molecule can carry or bind with 4 oxygen molecules. So one hemoglobin can carry how much oxygen? 4 hemoglobin molecules. When they are carrying 4 hemoglobin molecules, we call that oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. It's hemoglobin that is combined with oxygen. Oxyhemoglobin. You may see it abbreviated HbO2. Hb being hemoglobin, O2 being the oxygen. Now we can also have hemoglobin that is currently not carrying oxygen. However, let me add to that. Right now it's not carrying oxygen, but it is capable of carrying oxygen. It could carry it, but right now it just is not. We call that deoxyhemoglobin. Sometimes you'll hear folks use the term reduced hemoglobin. Deoxyhemoglobin is probably the best definition or best term to use. It's hemoglobin that's not bound with oxygen, but again, I'll put my asterisk here, but it's capable of.
Would it only be oxyhemoglobin if it has all 4 molecules of oxygen?
Correct, correct. Again, saturated with oxygen.
Okay.
Saturated with oxygen. But Faith, I see where you're going with that. Well, what if the hemoglobin, instead of carrying 4, is only carrying 3, right? Well, thankfully, because of the concept known as cooperative binding, our hemoglobin typically is either carrying 4 molecules of oxygen or it's carrying no molecules of oxygen, based on the concept of cooperative binding. If as soon as one hemoglobin molecule hops on board, one oxygen molecule hops on board that hemoglobin, the other 3 rapidly join. And when that fully saturated hemoglobin molecule gets to the tissue that needs to extract oxygen, as soon as one hops off, the other 3 hop off. So it's almost an all or nothing sort of concept there. My analogy is, it's your Uber with only 4 seats, right? Your Uber, it's your car, you're not counting the driver. It's your Uber, but there's only 4 seats. There's only 4 spots for the people to sit, the oxygen to sit. When it arrives, all 4 hop in. When you get to your destination, all 4 hop out. Okay, so if it's fully saturated, would we say that's 100%? If it's not saturated, we would say that's 0%. And really, we don't see the in-betweens here. But I'll explain why we see patients with saturations of 98% or 95% or 70% in just a second. All right, so by definition, hemoglobin is 100% saturated with oxygen if every hemoglobin molecule is combined with those 4 molecules of oxygen. We talk about percentage. When we talk about saturation, it's always in a percentage. That percentage of hemoglobin that is saturated with oxygen. Again, when we talk about normal oxygen saturation, of course we can get into some other ranges. I'm just sticking right now to how the textbook lists it. They said in normal saturation, in SaO2, S for saturation, O2, little a for arterial blood. The textbook lists a normal textbook oxygen saturation at 97.5%. Why did they just not call it 98 and be done with it? I don't know. But that's the textbook. All right, 97.5. Meaning, okay, well, what about 100%? Okay, well, if 97.5 is what we're carrying, there's probably about 2.5% that is not carrying oxygen, deoxyhemoglobin. And that's normal. That is me and you right now. Now, when we look at some other text and people talk about what's a normal oxygen saturation, what do we typically say? Just ballpark at a bedside. 95 to 100. Some folks will say, well, 93 to 100, 92 to 100. Some people may say, well, as long as it's in the 90s, we're probably okay. All right, so things we will talk about. But right now, I'm just talking about me and you, what we would expect our true oxygen saturation to be. So I'm going to go and just round that up and call that approximately 98%. But again, of course, I put a pulse ox on your finger right now and it says 96. I'm not scared. I'm not worried. Okay? That's perfectly acceptable. That's perfectly normal. I'm just trying to stick to how the textbook lists it. Now, normal SV, V standing for venous. Okay? Venous, instead of arterial blood, venous blood. So normal venous saturation about 75%. So we check the saturation of our arterial blood, again, I'm rounding up here, about 98% of it will be saturated. If we drew blood from a vein and we check the saturation, about 75% of it would be saturated. Again, where did the 23, 25% disappear to? The body, the tissues took that oxygen. Again, remember the body extracts about 25% of what was delivered. Kind of where that 25% number comes from. All right, just to explain saturation again. All right, this is not my picture. If it was my picture, I would do it just a little bit differently, but you get the point. Now, in this particular image, these things represent hemoglobin. There's 16 of them. We'll pretend that's a normal, and that is actually a normal, could be in the normal classification of hemoglobin, 16. But only half of them are carrying, and this is where I would draw this picture differently. I put 4 of these little oxygen molecules just to emphasize all 4. But let's just assume 1 equals 4. Only half of their total hemoglobin is carrying 4 molecules of oxygen. That's where we get a 50% saturation from. 75%, in this example, 3/4 of these hemoglobin are fully saturated with oxygen. There's a saturation of 75%, versus they're all saturated, there's 100%. And so when we see a 98%, that probably means, I can't think how many grams of hemoglobin we have. There's probably just a couple that are currently not fully saturated with oxygen. All right, just so when you're looking at those saturation numbers, whether it's a pulse ox or an arterial blood gas value, the number should make some semblance of sense to you to understand, okay, that's okay, or that's kind of borderline, or that's scary, that's very, very low. All right, so again, speaking of pulse oximetry, we rely on technology so much today, and rightly so. Technology's advanced so dramatically in the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's crazy what information we have available to us. But we can't always rely on the technology, because there still are flaws in technology. So hemoglobin's oxygen saturation is not an accurate measurement of blood oxygen content. Now, I will say, it's a part of it. It's a very big part. It's an important part of it. But I don't want you to put all your eggs in one basket and think, well, if their saturation is good or bad, then everything is fine or horrible, okay? So, it's not an accurate measurement of blood oxygen content. So my second bullet point here, so for example, if my patient, you check their pulse ox saturation and it says 100%, okay, which I see 100%, I'm thinking, okay, well that's good for my patient. Just because their saturation is 100% does not imply that the blood oxygen content is normal, or that their hemoglobin concentration is normal. What would the patient's oxygen saturation look like if they were anemic? What does anemia mean? Low red blood cell count. When you hear about someone having a low red blood cell count, again, what's in the red blood cell? Hemoglobin. What does hemoglobin carry? Oxygen. Uh-oh. So if hemoglobin count is low, that means the ability for the hemoglobin to carry oxygen to the tissues is going to be low and reduced. So, back to my question, what would oxygen saturation look like if the patient was anemic? Well, guess what it could look like? It could look normal. Because what does saturation tell us? It tells us how saturated the hemoglobin is with oxygen. If the patient's anemic, and again, you can see the picture here of how many erythrocytes or red blood cells are here. Here's the anemic patient. Again, what does saturation tell us? How saturated with oxygen the hemoglobin molecules are. And so, if each one of these are carrying 4 molecules of oxygen to the tissues versus what they're supposed to carry, all of these carrying 4, how much oxygen do you think really is getting to the tissues with the anemic patient? Much less than what it should normally be. And I can't tell you how many times clinically a patient will complain of being short of breath. I can't breathe. Well, let's use the technology. Let's stick a pulse ox in your finger. It says 100%, sir. Quit complaining Why are you whining? Your oxygen saturation is perfect. But what if the patient's anemic?
So it's like the delivery of the oxygen to the tissue that's messed up?
Again, the body needs a certain amount of oxygen, right? And so, how it normally should look, each one of these molecules of hemoglobin carrying the 4 molecules of oxygen, what's ultimately being delivered, fine with the normal amounts of hemoglobin, but when hemoglobin is reduced, again, there's only 4 on each one of these, how many are actually getting off at the next stop? Using the Uber analogy. I used to use a bus or taxi analogy, but I guess the Uber analogy. And again, the tissues need a certain amount of oxygen, and if we're just not able to provide enough hemoglobin, that means not enough oxygen is going to stop off at the tissues.
Got me thinking of the med
So
school bus now.
it's like how saturated the hemoglobin is, but not the amount of red blood cells
Correct.
that's going, so you're gonna have like.
Correct.
But the full box is supposed to show like.
It's going to tell me how saturated the patient's hemoglobin is with oxygen, but it doesn't. What's that?
The ones that are there, like.
The ones that are present, right. But it doesn't let me know if there's a whole bunch of hemoglobin or if there's very little hemoglobin. It just lets me know whatever's there, that's how saturated it is. So where we, again, technology's great, don't get me wrong, I'm gonna use that pulse oximetry like crazy, but it doesn't tell the whole picture. So again, your patient presents with shortness of breath, and all you're doing is checking what their pulse oximeter saturation is, and they're still complaining of shortness of breath. Well, the hemoglobin they have, asterisk, the hemoglobin they have is saturated with whatever that number is. Well, what if they're anemic? What if they're anemic? The tissues are missing out. No wonder they're complaining of shortness
So
of
then
breath.
this ties back to doing the arterials?
Well, even arterial saturation.
Okay.
Even when I look at a patient's arterial saturation, so I'm like, I'm not trusting this pulse ox. Let me go ahead and actually get some blood and let's measure the blood. Well, the saturation of the blood is still going to be the same. It's
Okay.
going to let me know what they have, how saturated it is. But also, I will say this, on the blood gas, it will also tell me the amount of hemoglobin. And you have to pay attention. I know when we get blood gases and get the reports, there's going to be a whole laundry list of different things. And I promise you, hemoglobin's probably somewhere toward the bottom of that list. We get hung up on looking at the other values and interpreting what we're seeing. Sometimes people will forget to look at that last line or two value, and many times it's hemoglobin. And everything else looks textbook normal, but the hemoglobin is low. No wonder the patient's what's getting to the tissues is not enough. All right, just another example. Again, if you think by the time the oxygen reaches the tissues that need them, even though both patient examples, the saturation is 100%, how much oxygen is really going to totally get off onto the tissues? The way it's supposed to be, that's going to give me enough oxygen molecules versus this one, ultimately there's not going to be enough being delivered, even though both patients have saturations of 100%. Questions? Okay, so all that to get to this. So what's the best way to know oxygen content?
Oh my
Well,
God.
there's a thing known as total oxygen content. Total oxygen content, which is the amount of oxygen carried by the hemoglobin plus the amount dissolved in blood plasma. And yes, those looking at the slides already know what's coming. John's second favorite formula of all time. Total oxygen content. Again, total oxygen content. Now let me explain what we're looking at here with the equation. So I'm just going to give you some examples where students have saw things incorrectly. C for content. Little a for arterial, oxygen. Sometimes I've had students look at this too quickly, and what they think they see is CO2. This is not carbon dioxide. I mean, I can understand where you're looking at it too quickly as you're skimming or scanning, and you think you see CO2. No, it's C, content, little a for arterial O2, otherwise known as total oxygen content. Now the first part of it, again, you'll ultimately do one side, the other side, and then add both sides together. Because again, what is this telling us? This is ultimately telling us the amount of oxygen carried by the hemoglobin. That's what this side of the equation tells us, as well as that oxygen dissolved in blood plasma, which is what this side tells us. All right, so the first part of the equation here, HB for hemoglobin. Remember before I said saturation alone doesn't tell the whole picture, because it doesn't tell me about hemoglobin? Well, this equation does. Hemoglobin times 1.34. 1.34 is a factor that's always going to be there. That tells me for each gram of hemoglobin, it will carry 1.34 milliliters of oxygen. So that constant is always there. That's going to be multiplied by the saturation. Again, if it's our saturation right now being normal 98%, I would have 0.98. My saturation was 93%, 0.93. What if my saturation was 100% times 1? Don't make it 0.1, or that means my saturation is only 10%. Of course, that would be horrible. That's the left side of the equation. This tells me how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. The right side, which was on that earlier plasma side, P little AO2, again, that's coming from the blood gas, just like this is coming from the blood gas, just like this is coming from the blood gas. Information I will obtain from the blood gas. P little AO2 times 0.003, again, tells me how much oxygen is dissolved in the blood plasma. When you do the calculation, and trust me, we'll do several here today. When we do the calculation, you're going to see this side number is significantly higher than this side's number. And again, why is that? Because most of the oxygen we're carrying is going to be bound to hemoglobin. A very small percentage of it will be dissolved in blood plasma.
What's up, KO2?
That's the partial pressure of oxygen in the artery, in the arterial blood. So the missing pieces here, the hemoglobin, the saturation, the P little AO2, is coming from arterial blood. Arterial blood, not from the pulse oximeter. What is the pulse oximeter? SpO2. So this is getting the arterial blood. And again, when you get arterial blood, you're going to be given this information, you're going to be given the saturation, you're going to be given hemoglobin. Now, important to note, what's normal? What is normal? Textbook normal is about 20 mLs per deciliter. Sometimes instead of mLs per deciliter, you may just simply see it abbreviated volumes percent. It means the same thing, volumes percent. With a range of about 16 to 21. Textbook normal is about 20, but a range of about 16 to 21. Again, volumes percent or mLs per deciliter. I promise you this is the last equation.
You're a liar.
Until we do something new. Okay? Until we do something new.
What, next week or something?
After the next test. And on to some more formulas, right? Alright, so I want you to calculate your own total oxygen content. Okay? So we can all do it together. Let's use the same numbers. Okay? Normally hemoglobin, you know, top of your head.
Like 11 to 14-ish.
Then it's different, male versus female. It's a little higher for a male, a little lower for a female. Let's just use an absolute simple, I'm trying to keep it simple, 15. 15 may be a little high for ladies, maybe a little on the low spectrum for men, but let's just use 15 so we're all using the same number. What's a normal saturation? According to today's talk, 98%. Okay, so that, make sure you have that 0.98 for 98%. P little AO2, so the amount of oxygen in the arterial system, the range is 80 to 100. Why don't we split the difference and just say 90? Okay, 90. P little a02, normally 90. And of course there's a range there, but let's just, for this example, this calculation, we'll use 90. So 15 times 1.34 times 0.98, that's the left side of the equation. P little a02, we said we were going to use 90 times 0.003, that's the right side of the equation. And then what you do for both sides? Add them. That's why I emphasize when I say this formula, total oxygen content. To get a total, you tend to do what? You have to add things together. Because some places will just call it the oxygen content. That's fine. I like to emphasize the word total. So you remember, what are you doing to both of these sides? Adding them together.
So are we doing 0.9 for the AO2 too?
No, that's
Okay,
that's
that's
90, 90.
Okay.
Yeah, that 90 is not a percent. That's 90 millimeters of mercury. So whatever your answer is, remember what I said normal was. Around 20 or a range of about 16 to 21. So if your number is not even anywhere close to those, you did something wrong. Yeah, throws his pen. Damn it.
I really want to.
Everybody come up with a number, or not sure? mLs per deciliter or volumes percent.
Would you round it up?
This one I would not.
Okay, so you make it very
This
specific.
one I would not,
Okay.
because it can get very particular.
Well,
The normal range is about 20.
The normal range is about 16 to 21, with the absolute normal being about 20. Okay, so let me see what I got. See if we agree. 19.96 is what my calculation was.
mhm.
Again, 15 times 1.34 times 0.98 should equal 16.69, or excuse me, 19.69. Left side. Right side, 90 times 0.003,
0.27.
0.27. Again, notice, this is a very small number. The amount of oxygen carried and dissolved in the blood plasma is a very small amount. Add the sides together, 19.96. Yes, Chris? The range is 80 to 100. 80 to 100. Now, we could use 100 here, if you wanted to. We could use 100 in here. The number's going to be a little bit different, but we could use 100 here. Right. Yep, they're very good. Yes, yes. Okay, everybody okay with the math here, at least to get this number? Because guess what's going to happen? We're going to have patients with different values than ours, and we need to know, are we providing, or are they able to provide themselves with enough oxygen? All right, so, second question. What's the CaOC, little a02, total oxygen content, if the patient's hemoglobin now is 9, saturation is 98%, and their PO2 is 90? Okay, so for this one, the left side of the equation, 9 times 1.34 times 0.98 should equal 11.8. The right side of the equation, 90 times 0.003, just like the previous example, 0.27. Add both sides together, 12.08. Again, mLs per deciliter or volumes percent. You'll find me, I tend to use volumes percent because it's a very simpler way to write it down, but both units mean the same thing. Math-wise, okay with solving this? Now let's compare this one to the previous one. R's, notice the numbers we used were exactly the same that we used in this example. The only thing that's different, hemoglobin. And so when you're presented with two different patients with the exact same saturation, the exact same P little AO2, but one person's total oxygen content is 20, and the next patient's total oxygen content is 12, no wonder that patient is suffering or why that patient is so short of breath. Again, their total oxygen content is significantly reduced from what it should be. And we clearly see why, right? The hemoglobin that they have appear to be well saturated, but the hemoglobin that they have, the normal hemoglobin can be anywhere from 12, 13, 16, 17. This one's only 9. Being able to not carry ultimately enough and deliver enough oxygen to the tissues. I think, help me here, those looking at the slide. I got one more? Okay, one more. And then I'll leave you alone for a bit with calculation. Here's a patient with a hemoglobin of 14. Their saturation's only 92%, so not quite textbook normal, with a P little AO2 of 72. Again, less than normal. Have a chance to calculate it?
One more second.
It's all right. Double check mine.
What?
So 14, the hemoglobin, times 1.34 times 0.98, again the saturation, that should be 17.25. The left side of the equation, which is 72 times
Oh, he rounded it up.
0.003, 0.216, add both sides together, we get nearly 17 and a half, just shy of 17 and a half volumes percent.
I got 17.46.
He rounded up.
Yeah, depends, when I punch it in the calculator, that's fine, we're on the same page.
That's why I was like, what?
Do you want us to round to the hundreds, or do you want us to round to the thousands, or should we?
Hundreds is probably fine. Beyond that, it's not necessary to go that far. I just wouldn't, for something like this, and I'm perfectly cool with us rounding, but for something like this, I want to leave it as at least a point something. I wouldn't want to round this and call this 17, or if it was just a couple more, to call it 18. So that's why you see me kind of leave it the way it is. But what is normal? What is considered a normal total oxygen content? The range 16 to 21. This falls within the range. Even though This person's saturation is definitely not normal. It's not horrible, but it's not normal. And their P-little-a-O2 is not normal. The low end, at least the P-little-a-O2 is 80. It's 72, it's less than that. However, because this patient had such a good amount of hemoglobin, they're still able to carry enough oxygen to the tissues that need them. So picture this is your patient in room 2, and going back to that previous patient, here's the patient in room 1. Even though their saturation looks great compared to the other patient, 98 versus 92, and blood gas PO2 was 90 versus 72, the second patient's the one who's actually doing, this patient is actually doing better.
It's like a teeter-totter.
Getting more oxygen to the tissues, okay? By simply knowing what? Total oxygen content. Total oxygen content. Because ultimately, we're trying to make sure the body's receiving what?
Air.
Enough oxygen. Enough oxygen.
That's the thing that you're gonna check ABCs and all this stuff, you probably already used the clinical time.
Of course,
Even though
of
the
course.
oxygen is good, 98, something that needs to explain how they are tired or what
Exactly,
the
of course,
breathing.
absolutely, absolutely. But when we're ultimately trying to figure out and decide, all these numbers look good from what we're assessing at the bedside, but the patient still has their complaints, and of course, we're just looking at one little small piece of the picture here. If their heart's not pumping enough, then that could explain the problem. Their blood pressure's not high enough, that of course could explain some other issues. This is just one small piece of the picture. But it's where we can easily be fooled by just only focusing on saturation. Because saturation, I would expect someone who's healthy, you guys, to have a great saturation, and if you weren't doing very well, that your saturation would fall. Of course, I would expect that. But there can be those gray area situations where, boy, the saturation is not perfect, but the patient says they're fine, they have no complaints or no issues, or someone who has a very high saturation number that I think, oh, that's perfect, but they're complaining that they can't breathe, and they can't catch their breath, just simply based on knowing the big picture, total oxygen content. I told you it wasn't too bad, it's gonna be too bad today. All right, so a couple of questions for you guys, couple of questions. Actually, I'm gonna, 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. 4 questions, so, don't blurt it out, let me read it. So the question is, how much oxygen is normally delivered to the tissues? Answer options are 150 mLs per minute, 250 mLs per minute, 500 mLs per minute, or 1,000 mLs per minute. How much is delivered? How much is delivered? 1,000 mLs per minute is delivered. Okay, everybody snap that picture if you need it. Now I'm going to just change the question ever so slightly. How much oxygen is normally consumed by the tissues? There's your 250. So be careful when I ask this question later that you pay attention. Are we talking about just simply delivered, or how much is actually taken or consumed? Now, of course, you notice I'm going to make sure 250 and 1,000 appear in every one of those questions. Right? It's going to happen. It's a 50-50 shot here. I know it's one of those two, but let's get it right. I'm telling you right now, I am going to ask both of those questions. How much is delivered? 1,000. How much is consumed? 250. And that's of O2. O2. All right, third question here. Most of the oxygen in the blood is carried by plasma, white blood cells, macrophages, or hemoglobin. Hemoglobin. Approximately what percentage? 98% of the oxygen we're carrying in our blood right now is bound to hemoglobin. I didn't ask this, but the remainder is carried by plasma. What percentage of that?
2.
Only 2% is carried by the blood plasma, or dissolved in the blood plasma, I should say. What, no oxygen being carried by the white blood cells, or macrophages aren't, with all the cleaning that the macrophages are doing, they're not grabbing some O2 as well? No. All right, final question. What's the patient's total oxygen content? The patient's lab data shows a hemoglobin of 12, saturation of 95%, PCO2, P little a CO2 of 47, P little AO2 of 82, and the patient's on 40% oxygen. You see your answer options. Hopefully it's not F that you're picking. But if you notice, with what I've given you, the information I've given you, I'm not asking for it here, but based on what I've given you, I could even ask for what is this patient's alveolar air. Now, I didn't ask for it, so don't solve that right now, but based on the information I've given you in this, be prepared for when I do ask this question on the test, that I give you this extra stuff that you don't need. Again, what is John asking for? C little AO2, total oxygen content. Hemoglobin times 1.34 times SaO2 plus P little AO2 times 0.003. Add both sides together. Again, total oxygen content. When the clicking slows down, that's what most of you guys already got. There. What's the right answer? You're in C, but I'm not getting too many confident C's.
It's C.
It is C. You did your math, and you can more than welcome to snap a picture of that. So 12 times 1.34 times 0.95, because that was the saturation. Did that math, it comes out to be 15.27. The P little AO2, 82 times 0.003, you get the right side there, add both sides together, and of course, on the answer options, I rounded that C up to 15.5. But where do students make mistakes with this equation?
They plug in the wrong numbers.
Yeah, they plug in the wrong numbers. Yeah. Any questions on that one? That's good. They end up plugging CO2 in here, because remember alveolar air, you need to take the CO2. Students, when they do the alveolar air, sometimes accidentally grab the PO2 instead of CO2. Okay, that happens. In the alveolar air equation, you're solving two sides, and you're doing what to both sides? Subtracting. This one you add. That's why I've been emphasizing the word total oxygen content. Total meaning add both sides together. You know, when I create wrong answers, what I'm going to do, on one I'm going to add, on this one I'm going to subtract, and see who I can fool into picking a wrong choice. Right? So pay attention. Be careful when you're doing these calculations. Especially my two favorite, alveolar air and total oxygen content. And here's another one. Wasn't there a kind of just a factor in alveolar air number? What was that number? It's the last part of alveolar air. Taking the CO2 times 1.25. I've seen students plug 1.25 here, or take this and somehow throw it into the alveolar air equation formula, where you end up getting both formulas and you end up merging, creating some crazy calculations. Now, just as we typically do on any sort of test day, the second I start passing out the Scantron, because I always start with the Scantron, you're more than welcome to take that Scantron, flip it over, start writing equations down just so you can memory dump them and have your own personal cheat sheet. Or wait until I pass out the test and write it on the top of the test or the back of the test, whatever works for you. Okay? I would say, if anything, for those equations, so you don't get them mixed up before you even start reading questions, write down the formulas on the Scantron or on the test itself. And that way you'll have them for the test. Now, in case you're curious, I haven't finished the test yet, but in case you're curious, well, how much math am I gonna have to do? How many times am I gonna have to grab that calculator? 45 total questions on the test. I bet you there's gonna be probably 6 or 7 mathematical equations that you have to solve. Some people may say, only 6 or 7? Can you give me a little bit more? Because I've got the formula. As long as I know the formula, I'm good. Probably only gonna be about 6 or 7 formulas. And on Wednesday, I'll go over the list one last time. This is the formula you need to know, this formula, I think, what is there? 5 or 6 maybe for this test? I think there's more than 4. But I'll kind of go over them again, just to, don't forget to review these calculations. That being said, also important to note, well, what's normal? Because what if I give you a question and I say, of the 4 patients here, which one has the best total oxygen content? Which patient would have the most oxygen being delivered to the tissues? And all I give you, I solved the math for you already, I simply give you these numbers, right? So you do have to make sure you remember what the number means. Is it better to have a higher number or a lower number? Or maybe I ask the question, which of the following is normal? You know, so make sure, even though it might not necessarily be a question you're solving math, it still could be a question that's coming from this information, by knowing this information. Not that you had to solve the math, because maybe I solved the math for you on some of these questions. All right? What questions you guys have for me?
Why?
Because it's fun. Why do you suffer? No, I'm kidding. Because number one, the MDRC could ask these same questions, plus they could ask the math questions. But you've heard me say it before. The MDRC is not going to go crazy having you do calculations. Well, what the MDRC could do, and they will ask a few equations, not many, but a few. But what they instead turn around and do is they'll give you the number, but it has to mean something. It just can't be, and even if you got the math part, fine, that's great, but the number has to mean something. You just can't say, okay, it's 15.5, I don't know what that means, but I can do the math. Because what if the MDRC solves the math for you? Now, what do you think's next? Bam, worksheet, thank you very much. I'm here all week. So, so if you were to sit there and take these worksheets that I've given you up to this point, and say, what mathematical questions could John ask me on the upcoming test? You're looking at them. I just do this to make sure you're comfortable with the math part of it.
Yeah, it's the Apple one. I think it was $99. It's been a while since I gave it for sure.
Alright, so this first one, their hemoglobin is 12, their P little AO2 is 88 millimeters of mercury, and the saturation S little AO2 is 93%. And the question is, what's their total oxygen content? Anyone brave enough to tell me a number? 15.21, somewhere in there, okay? Yep. So left side of the equation should be 14.95, right side of the equation 0.264. Have we had any right side of the equation that was anything different than 0.2 something or thereabouts? Because it doesn't really make that dramatic of a difference in the total oxygen content. Again, because it's only about, lucky if it's 2% of the total. This used to be my shortcut cheat moment for the board exam. I would tell my students, if you're doing this on the board exam, because the answer options are going to be far enough apart, I would tell them, don't even do that side of the equation, do that and then see which one is closest to your answer, and that's probably 9 times out of 10 the right answer on the board. Again, it goes back to teaching students to not have to do too much math when you did not have a calculator. But now it's like, yeah, might as well do the whole thing just to make sure you're exact. So this about 15.2, 15.21 mLs per deciliter or volumes percent.
We're gonna be able to use a calculator on the board exam, right?
Yes, but it's a calculator the board exam provides.
Okay.
So you're not going to physically bring a calculator in with you.
Is it gonna be
Nope.
on the computer?
It's on the computer screen
Okay.
itself. Yeah, and you can toggle the calculator function back and forth.
Okay.
When you don't need it, you can toggle it away so it's just not